When we think about sex, we usually think in human terms, right? But what if I told you the real story starts way, way smaller? Not with people, but with individual cells. Today, we're going to trace that incredible journey, all the way from the fundamental building blocks of life to the actual laws that shape our society. Let's dive in.
So, let's kick things off with a really big question. If you look at all the staggering diversity of life on this planet, from fungi to fish to you and me, what is the one single universal rule that biologically defines male and female? The answer, as you're about to see, is probably simpler and honestly more profound than you might think.
So here's our game plan. We'll start with that universal definition. Then we're going to explore the absolutely wild variety of ways nature actually determines sex. After that, we'll zoom right in on the human development story, see how that biological idea gets translated into our legal system, and finally, we'll look at a major case study in equality, Title IX. Okay, let's get right into part one, the universal definition. We're going to strip away all the layers of complexity for a second and get right down to the one core principle that really started it all. The answer to our big question, it all comes down to this one biological concept, anisogamy. Now, I know that word sounds super technical, right? But the idea behind it is actually incredibly simple. It just means that sexual reproduction happens when two different types of sex cells, or gametes, come together. And the only thing that fundamentally separates them is their size. And this gets right to the heart of it. By a universal scientific convention, the individual that produces the small, mobile gametes, sperm, is defined as the male. And the one that produces the large, stationary gamete, the egg or ovum, is defined as the female. Seriously, that's it. This one single difference in the size of a cell is the biological bedrock for everything else we're going to talk about today. Okay, so if the definition is that simple, where does all the complexity come from? Well, that brings us perfectly to our next section, where we get to see all the wild and wonderful ways that nature decides who gets to make which kind of gamete. And this is the crucial takeaway right here. The definition of male and female based on that gamete size is just about universal. But the mechanism for actually getting there? Oh, nature has a whole playbook of different systems. It's not one size fits all.
And wow, this table just shows you a fraction of that amazing diversity. We've got our familiar XY system where that Y chromosome kicks off male development. But in birds, it's a totally different ZW system where the female actually determines the sex of the offspring. And then you get to crocodiles. They don't even have sex chromosomes. It's the temperature of the nest that decides. And don't even get me started on clownfish, who can literally change their sex during their lifetime. It is an absolutely incredible display of evolutionary creativity.
Okay, so keeping all that incredible diversity in mind, let's zoom way in. It's time to leave the rest of the animal kingdom behind for a moment and focus on the really specific developmental story in our own species, the human pathway.
So here's something wild. For the first 6 weeks or so of development, a human embryo is in what's called a bipotential state. That means it literally has the foundational plumbing for both male and female reproductive systems, these things called the Wolffian and Mullerian ducts. At that early stage, it truly has the potential to develop along either pathway.
So what pushes it one way or the other? Well, in an XY embryo, it all starts with one single gene on the Y chromosome, called the SRY gene. You can think of it like a master switch. The second it flips on, it sets off this whole hormonal cascade, like a set of dominoes. First, it tells the gonads to become testes. Then, those brand new testes start pumping out hormones. Testosterone gets to work building the male internal system from the Wolffian ducts, while another hormone, AMH, actively takes apart the precursors for the female system. Okay, so what happens in an XX embryo? It's actually pretty simple. There's no Y chromosome, so there's no SRY gene. That master switch never gets flipped. And without that initial signal, the whole process just defaults to the female pathway. The gonads become ovaries, the male ducts fade away, and the female Mullerian ducts go on to develop into the uterus, fallopian tubes, and so on.
All right, this is where our story takes a really big turn. We've gone deep into the biology, right? But now we have to ask the big question. How does a society take this biological concept of sex and turn it into a legal framework that's designed to make sure things are fair and equal for everyone?
This right here, this sentence, is the bridge. It's from a massive piece of civil rights law, and what it does is profound. It takes the word sex and elevates it from just a biological category into a legal shield, a protection against discrimination.
And the law we're talking about is called Title IX. It was passed back in 1972, and it gives us a perfect case study for how this biological concept of sex gets defined and interpreted, and then applied in the real world to try and create fairness in education.
So, for our final section, let's really dig into Title IX. Not just what it is, but what it actually does out in the world and how it's applied.
At its heart, Title IX is a pretty simple but incredibly powerful idea. The rule is straightforward. If you're a school or any kind of education program that takes money from the federal government, you are not allowed to discriminate against anyone on the basis of sex. But almost all of the power of this law, and frankly a lot of the modern debate around it, comes down to how we interpret those four crucial words. And what's so interesting to see is just how broadly those protections have been interpreted over the decades. I mean, look at this. Sex-based discrimination isn't just one thing. It's been applied to cover everything from providing equal opportunities in sports, to protection from harassment, preventing discrimination against pregnant students, unfair dress codes, and even making sure there's equal access to STEM fields.
When you boil it all down, the goal remains constant: to level the playing field. The whole purpose of the law is to make sure that a person's sex isn't used as a barrier that prevents them from getting an education or having the chance to succeed.
And that brings our whole journey full circle, doesn't it? We started out at the microscopic level, just looking at the simple size difference between two tiny cells. And we followed that single thread through complex biology, through human development, and all the way to the massive societal scale of a federal law that shapes opportunities for millions of people.
So, I'll just leave you with this to think about. We've seen that the biological story of sex is, kind of paradoxically, both incredibly simple at its core and amazingly complex in how it all plays out. The real question for all of us is, how can a deeper, more honest understanding of all that complexity actually help us build a fair and more equitable world? Thanks for watching.